Hello and welcome to today's European SharePoint Office 365 and Azure Community webinar. My name is Shane and I'm delighted to be joined by Bill Ayers, MCM, MVP, MCT, Flow Simulation Limited UK, who will be talking to you today about an overview of the Microsoft 365 development platform. Remember to join in the conversation about today's webinar on Twitter. Our Twitter handle is @EuropeanSP and our hashtag is ESPC19. Don't forget to check out the Resource Center. This is packed with the latest blogs, ebooks, webinars, and how-to videos. Simply visit SharePointEurope.com and click the content link at the top. Check out our super early bird offer for ESPC19. Save €350 per ticket. See SharePointEurope.com for full details. After the webinar, we will have a questions and answers session. Type any question you have for Bill in the questions window. Some questions will be answered at the end of the presentation. This webinar will be recorded and added to the Resource Center, where you'll be notified by email when it is available. And now I'm going to pass you over to our webinar presenter, Bill Ayers. Hello, Bill.
Hello, Shane. How are you?
I'm super. Hopefully now you can take control and take it away.
I hope so. Yes. Thanks very much, Shane. And thanks for joining everybody. So this is a revised and updated version of a talk I gave at ESPC in Copenhagen last November. And I've added a few things that have come out fairly recently. So this is a fairly broad canvas, several canvases in fact, and therefore I won't be able to cover anything in any great detail. So there'll be no deep dives on any particular topic. Really, the idea of this talk is to look at the Microsoft 365 development platform as a whole, and particularly look at some of the tools and techniques that we can use pretty much everywhere, of which there are quite a few. So here's my Twitter handle and my email address if you want to follow up with questions after the webinar is finished, and I'll do my best to answer them. And as Shane says, you can put questions in the chat window as well, and we'll get through as many of those as we can at the end of the seminar. So I've also got a sort of a blog site where I've written a few articles, not very much, I'm afraid, but working on that. But you can go to there at spdoctor.net or .com, both of those work. So since we were in Copenhagen, when I originally gave the talk, there was a bit of a Lego theme, because Lego is Danish, of course. And it's actually very appropriate because Lego is a system where all the pieces are very carefully designed to fit together. And sometimes they fit together in ways that aren't immediately obvious. So, for example, you might not know that the Duplo, which is the sort of the young children's version of Lego with the bigger bricks, and the proper Lego bricks are actually compatible, because the tubes inside the Lego bricks actually fit into the studs on the Duplo bricks. So you can sort of combine these things in perhaps a way you wouldn't immediately think was going to work. And if you've got very small children, then that could well be the main takeaway from the talk right there. So Office is really ubiquitous in the business world, at least. So for the last 20 years, web development has been the big thing, and that's really a kind of an accident of deployment, because web development is big because web browsers are everywhere. They're easy to install, usually pre-installed on every machine. But you know, the funny thing is, Office is also very widely distributed as well. There's actually, this is an incredible number, probably even more now, is 1.2 billion users of Office, by which I mean the Office clients, Excel, PowerPoint, Outlook, Word, OneNote as well, and a few others. These are the Office clients that are very widely used in business, almost 100% of the business world is using these Office client applications. And then in addition, there's, it says on this slide, 150 million, is probably about 180 million users of the Office 365 products, which are often now sold as a Microsoft 365 license, including Windows 10. And then there's also 400 million Outlook.com users, which is the consumer version of those products. So what with that and all the versions that are available for different platforms in addition to Windows, like iOS and Android and OS 10, and in browsers, of course, there's a huge reach for these Office applications. So you could think of it in the same way as a really good opportunity to get your software into the hands of users in much the same way that the web technologies allow you to do the same thing. And it has the additional advantage that the users are already in these Office applications doing their work. They don't have to go out to a browser or some other application. They can continue to work in the application that they're already using. So it's a great opportunity, particularly with as Microsoft 365, which isn't really just a product bundling. It's like a whole design thing where they're trying to make all these components work better together. So there's never been a better time to look at Office and Office 365 and Microsoft 365 as your development platform that you want to build software for, either as a commercial product for selling in a store or internally as a line of business application to improve the productivity of your own organization. But it is a huge developer API surface to get your head around, and it's sometimes a little difficult to work out what to do when and what to use in which situation. There are a lot of components, and we're going to touch on some of these in this talk, and particularly see how we can reuse, if not actual code across different applications that we might build, then at least the knowledge and the skills that we've developed we can reuse across these different canvases and different business solutions. So it's really all about getting as much business benefit as we can with the minimum amount of development effort. So looking at the Office 365 platform, you can think in terms of canvases. Now, this is a bit of a corporate marketing slide, but I think it's useful to think about documents, which means the Office clients, Word, Excel, PowerPoint, and so forth. And then the conversations canvas, which really means Teams as we move away from Skype towards Teams now. And then pages, which is fundamentally SharePoint, but can also appear as part of Teams, as part of the underlying infrastructure of that product. And we can extend that now. If we talk about Microsoft 365 as a platform, we're already starting to see things like the Windows timeline as another canvas we can add to that and make that 4, where we can build things for that as well. So gradually we'll see more and more features of Windows, I think, as that we can use these same development techniques for. And they kind of run across a spectrum from, one extreme, there's no development, we just use a bought-in product. We've kind of got to do our due diligence as developers and say, is there something that we could just buy to do this rather than have to build something from scratch? And then we can work up through declarative markup. We'll look at a few of those, and then the slightly more sophisticated things such as actionable messages. And eventually we move on to building things with perhaps some pre-built controls or our own custom controls on top of JavaScript and HTML and CSS, and building solutions that way, which is full development. It's a full development platform at the right-hand end of this scale. And we kind of work up through the gears when we're looking at a set of business requirements, and we want to do the minimum we can get away with. And there's no shame in using, say, something like a Power App, for example, which is, there isn't really a sort of a coding activity in there, not directly anyway. We don't, we're developers. It doesn't mean we have to use develop everything from scratch. If there's a tool that we can use that will satisfy that business requirement without doing too much development work, then everybody wins. So we can build things in conversations such as bots, and we can build these Office add-ins in our documents, and we can build things like SharePoint Framework web parts in our pages. And all of these can be built using the Microsoft Graph as the source of the information in Office 365 and more broadly Microsoft 365 to get at the data behind the platform as a whole if we're building on top of Microsoft 365. So if we want to look at package solutions, we can just quickly look at app source. So just bring the app source page up, but that's at that's not app source. So it's at appsource.microsoft.com, and this is Microsoft's store. It's been through several iterations over the years. It keeps getting revamped from time to time. This current incarnation, which is AppSource, they attempt to give you different categories of application, and you can refine by industry and then by the type of product you want to build for. So we're probably interested in Office 365. I can check that, and then you can see how many different applications there are in particular areas. So collaboration might be of interest, and then we can drill down. And the slightly disappointing thing is in some of these areas you don't actually get any results. So that's one of the drawbacks, is that it's not quite on the scale of, say, the Google Play store, where you've almost got too many choices. But it does help you find applications that are pre-existing and relevant to what you want to do. And if I shall search for one here called Reactor, which is one that we've built, and go to that, and that should then bring up the Reactor product, I hope. Looks like the web conferencing software is stealing all my bandwidth at the moment. And that should eventually, where is it? Can probably already loaded it earlier, and I can just cheat and go back to it there. I've got a cached page here. So this is an email response tool. It's an Office add-in that you can go, and I've got a video here that explains what it does if you're interested. But this is all built with JavaScript and HTML5. And it's one of these Office add-ins. You can install it, and it will assist you in responding to email. So if that's the business requirement, you might find that you can just install this and satisfy that requirement. More likely, you won't find exactly what you want in the store, and you'll then start looking at, well, what other options do I have? Now, I'm not going to go into Power Apps and Flow in this talk. People are talking about this a lot. It's a very interesting topic, and there's some great demos out there and people have done great things with it. But in essence, Flow is a bit like Workflow, as we used to have in SharePoint, for example. We used to build them in our old friend SharePoint Designer, happy days. Now we have this great tool, Flow, which is excellent, does a similar kind of thing. And then Power Apps, which is sort of a tool for building very simple, actually not necessarily that simple applications, which will work on mobile devices and on the web and in a client on a desktop client. And you can build actually very, very useful applications, or even just look at it as sort of perhaps as a prototyping tool. You want to try something out and decide whether you want to then continue and develop it further as a more of a custom application. But you can build these things out. As I say, I won't go go through it, but you can build these things that they can connect to. There are various connectors, so there's a connector model for it, which gives you an opportunity to perhaps build something on the back end using code that you can then enhance. So it's not a complete cliff edge when it doesn't quite do what you want to. There are ways of extending it using code as well. So this is just looking at these business flows that you can create. It's somewhat similar to building SharePoint Designer workflows. And many people have written or recorded some excellent webinars. I'm sure there are some in this series where you can learn all about it. And there are lots of connectors as well. So lots of vendors have provided connectors to their backend systems that you can very quickly link up to. And of course, you can create your own as well. Now, another interesting sort of low-code solution is these actionable messages. It's a fairly specific use case, but it actually, well, it's a specific type of solution, but it actually covers a lot of use cases. So typically what you'll do is you'll have a, say in this case as an example, an expense report application which sends an email to a user who needs to approve an expense report. So we might have our company expense report system. The user creates an expense on the system, and then an email is sent to a manager for approval. And typically that email would have a link to view the expense report, and the manager will then click on the link, and it might go to contoso.com's expenses, or maybe it's a hacker and it's a phishing email and it takes them to conbozo.com, and they're going to capture their credentials. So it's not very secure. We generally don't want to get users into the habit of just clicking on links in emails to log into systems. Then you have to probably find the particular expense claim that they've asked you to approve, and then when they get back to their email system at some future point, they'll probably see the email again which hasn't changed, and they'll be thinking, well, did I approve this already or not? And they'll repeat the process. So it's really an awful user experience. So actionable messages are a brilliant and very simple idea. It's some functionality that's actually built into Outlook that knows how to deal with this package that's included in a script tab, actually in the message that's sent to Outlook. And then all the information is right there in the message. It says, the message would say, here's your expense report, do you approve it or not? And the user, the manager would click on approve. And then the beauty of it is that the email message itself then changes to say the expense report is approved. They can view it online if they want to, but it's a much better workflow, and people just love this, and it's been hugely popular. And there's some tooling to make that possible. So if I just go over to my browser, and there's a couple of bits of websites. One is called the Message Card Playground. And what you can do there is select a sample, and there are a number of these using adaptive cards. I'll come to adaptive cards in a second. They can also use these legacy message cards, which was the old way, but recommend now that you try and use adaptive cards, because this is something that you can reuse not only in these actionable messages, but also in Teams and numerous other places as well. We'll see the adaptive cards designer in a second. So this is the message card playground, and what you can do is construct one of these. Now, it's not a WYSIWYG designer. We've just got some a JSON template that it uses, and the idea is that it's a halfway house between. It's not, some people say, well, why don't you just use full HTML and CSS rather than these adaptive cards? So it's dealing with sort of the 80-20 case, the 80% case, where most of these things have a fairly consistent structure, and you can reuse them reuse these design elements, and then it's the job of the adaptive card itself to figure out how to render itself on various different platforms. I can actually log in here. I won't do this now, but I can log in to my email account and send one of these cards to myself and see it in the browser. Sorry, in Outlook. And then there's an adaptive card designer. So there's two different concepts here. There's the message, the actionable messages are a feature of Outlook effectively, and then the adaptive cards, which can be used in numerous different places. And in fact, there's a drop down here where you can say, okay, this is what it looks like in a bot framework web chat. This is what it looks like in Windows timeline. This is what it looks like in Teams dark theme. And the Outlook actionable messages, which is the one that we're looking at the moment, would look like this. So it sort of responds to the environment that it's rendered in. And then you've got, in this case, you've got a nice visual designer. And if you want to try that, say, if I wanted to, I can drag and drop elements and see what it looks like. So it's, I've got quite a nice designer here, and it all ends up being this JSON file, which I can copy actually, not that bit, copy this bit and copy it over to the message card playground and paste it in there. These two things are compatible, even though they're not the same tool, they work together. So I can then send that. I could log in and send it to myself. So nice tooling around it, very simple, but a huge amount of business benefit that you can, if you've got any kind of a workflow of this type where somebody has to approve something, or it could even be on the development side, GitHub notifications and things like that. Lots of things you can do, and there are a few examples as well here that you can look at. Some of them are a bit more exotic with flight itineraries and things like that. So lots of examples to start with, and really a very useful tool. Very low code, well, no code really, but extremely powerful and useful. So that's adaptive cards, which I probably spent a little bit too long talking about, but it is an interesting topic. A similar kind of thing is, I should just mention, is site designs in SharePoint. So again, it's a JSON format that gives you a way of doing pretty much the same thing that we used to do years and years ago with site templates, except without some of the many disadvantages that had. And some of us got into a bit of a pickle with site templates, but this is all robust and rock solid, and you can set these up. You can add things like lists and themes and logos, and also do things that will trigger a flow, which again gives you a way out into doing some custom development by building something in Azure or some other cloud-hosted service that you can trigger. And then use something like PowerShell or REST to install that site template that you've created into your SharePoint environment. And then I was going to do a demo of this, but I think I'm going to skip it. But all I would have shown was you go to a SharePoint, create a new site, and then in that drop down where it says, do you want to create a communications site or a team site, you get additional options once you've installed these site templates. So it's a very nice and clean, and again, virtually no code way of building extensions to SharePoint. Right, so now most people who are developers will then say, well, okay, that's great, and there's absolutely no shame in using that kind of approach, because and in fact, nobody needs to know, do they? I mean, we're developers. I hope there are no managers listening, but we don't have to make a big deal about how we used a solution that wasn't really involving much code or any code at all. I mean, the point is that we've satisfied the business requirement, and if we can do that as efficiently as possible, then everybody wins. But as a developer, you kind of hoping that you won't find an existing product, and you won't be able to do it in one of these, because as developers we kind of want to do proper in quotes development. And the funny thing about development nowadays is we've kind of come full circle in that we used to be all the time in Visual Studio, and it was all a great integrated development environment with, it was always my goal was I just want to stay in Visual Studio all the time and just build or get add-ins to Visual Studio. Now everybody wants to be at the command line, which is ironic because when I started software development, the command line was really all you had, and now that's what everybody's using, these command line tools, which have come largely from the web development world. And these are some of the tools that we're going to look at now, and we're going to see how we can use those to build for all these canvases that I mentioned before. And as a matter of fact, I don't even have Visual Studio installed on this laptop that I've had for about 6 weeks now. In fact, I'm not sure I've even got room in its very limited amount of disk memory to install it. So it kind of, that might be a jarring thing depending on what your development background is. So if you've come from, say, a lot of SharePoint developers like me, which is my background, or over the last couple of decades anyway, that you've used Visual Studio and ASP.NET web forms, which SharePoint was, in terms of server-side development, was built around. Those are the tools that we know. Visual Studio is the tool we spent all our time in, and a lot of people who moved into SharePoint development came from ASP.NET development, and a lot of the features of ASP.NET web forms came from SharePoint, like web parts originally came from SharePoint and then found their way into the ASP.NET platform itself. So we used to develop solutions on SharePoint. I'm thinking about 10 years ago, spent a lot of time building these things, building web parts, server-side web parts, and timer jobs and all these good things. And there'd be somebody else who would be called a front-end developer, typically on these teams, who would be doing all the little tricks in JavaScript to make it work in Internet Explorer, usually, which was usually the issue. And it was a very different perspective. So we used to, I have to say, I'm not proud of this, but I think I tended to look down a little bit on JavaScript as not a proper development language and something that was really just for scripting in a web page, whereas the front-end developers, they were using tools like JavaScript, but perhaps in a fairly simple way. They would tend to use libraries like jQuery to get around some of the difficulties of the browser incompatibilities, and perhaps even a web design tool. And they tend to spend most of their time complaining about Internet Explorer. So it was a very, very different perspective. Now, I think I would strongly encourage you to, if you're still thinking that way as about disliking JavaScript, just have another look at JavaScript. It is actually, when you dig into it, a very well-written language. It has some very fundamental flaws, however, some mistakes. It was written by Brendan Eich in about 10 days, the original version. So I think, it's a fantastic achievement and a very beautifully written language, not a classical language. So if you come from a C# or a C++ or even a Java background, their inheritance model or their object-oriented model looks rather different from the classes that we use in those languages, and it takes a little bit of getting used to. So you can think of C# and ASP.NET and those tools as like the Meccano mechanical construction set. I can build an engine, and it's got a conrod, that connects the wheels, and I can build quite sophisticated gearboxes and things like that. Whereas in, by analogy, in JavaScript, in Lego, you could kind of plug the pieces together, but you couldn't make that conrod between the wheels so easily that it wasn't that sophisticated. But now we can use tools like TypeScript, for example, which gives us a lot of the advantages of developing in a more classical language like C#. It solves a lot of the problems that are fundamental to the JavaScript language. It gives us features, particularly that will be coming eventually in JavaScript, but aren't quite there yet in terms of deployment on browsers. So I like to think of this combination of TypeScript, perhaps libraries like React.js, which I'd recommend. No time to go into React.js now, but it's one of several client-side development libraries that you can choose. I would recommend looking at React.js in the first instance if you haven't already got a commitment to another client-side library. Visual Studio Code rather than Visual Studio, and that's a much more lightweight, really a code editor rather than an integrated development environment, although you'd be surprised how much you can do. And Node.js, which is back to JavaScript, but running server-side, which is used as what we would have used IIS, Internet Information Services, IIS server for in our development, and also as a platform, as a sort of build and development platform, which is nice because it then becomes cross-platform. So it doesn't really matter. It's why we see so many people using Macintoshes, because they can, because they're using Node.js to build everything on top of. So this is a very nice tool chain that we can build out of these. It's like the Lego Technic, it's got the advantage. We can build conrods and very sophisticated things with it, but it has many of the advantages of Meccano, which was a much more powerful construction set, but difficult to use, and it's got the advantages of JavaScript, of Lego, that it's easy to snap all the pieces together. So we kind of get the best of both worlds, and that's working very well as this sort of modern development tool chain. And I haven't really put a hate under this category. I don't really hate anything, but I'm not too keen on the sort of spending an hour or so installing Visual Studio and these very big bulky tools. So these are very quick to install. Visual Studio Code you can install in a couple of minutes. Node.js doesn't take much longer. The one step that does take a while is resolving all the dependencies, and I'm not going to use that in my demos. So really what lies behind all of these, or ties them all together, apart from using this modern development tool chain, is we use these manifest files. So whether the canvas, remember the canvases from that very early slide, which were the documents, the conversations, and the pages, in order to get something onto the canvas, we have some kind of manifest file, and this might be a JSON file, or a JavaScript object notation, or it might be XML, which is what we used to all rave about 10 years ago, and we've kind of moved on to JSON now as our sort of serialization format. And then the manifest file points to possibly a website that we're hosting somewhere, which might have a website that does something, or it might just be some static JavaScript and HTML and CSS files, or it might even just be a CDN, a content delivery network URL that gives us some content. So there's a lot of flexibility. If we do build a website, we can build that using whatever technology we want. So we're not constrained to using, for example, ASP.NET MVC, although that would be an excellent choice. We could perfectly well use Node.js, which I actually do quite a bit because I really enjoy using the same tools everywhere, not having to switch technologies if possible. But if you're a Ruby on Rails fanatic, you could use that. Heaven help us, if you want to use PHP, you could use that as well. So it doesn't really matter what web hosting technology you use or where it is, particularly as long as you can see it from the client. So typically that means putting it on the internet somewhere in Azure or some other cloud hosting provider, or just put it in a CDN if it's just static content. And then the manifest points to the content that we're going to show, and then that gets rendered inside some kind of container, typically sandboxed in some way inside the canvas. So that might be, for example, if we're looking at it in a browser, that will typically be an iframe. If we're in a client application, it will use what's called the Web Extensibility Framework, which is a container that's been provided to host these HTML pages and all the JavaScript behind them and so on. So this we'll see this pattern over and over again in these as we apply these techniques to these different canvases. So the modern development tool chain is really Node.js, which is, as I say, cross-platform. We'll often use Yeoman generators. So Yeoman is a tool for scaffolding out applications. Think of it as the file new project in Visual Studio. So it just gives you that starter project. In general, it's something to get you going. I mean, I wouldn't say once a project gets underway, you're probably not going to be using the Yeoman generator again. You're more likely to take an existing project that you've built, or perhaps one on GitHub, and make a copy of that and clone it, and then use that as a starting point. But to get going with these technologies, particularly for learning, these Yeoman generators are extremely useful, and we've got a few of them. There's one for Office, which we'll look at in a moment. There's one for SharePoint, and for the SharePoint framework solutions, which is for the Pages canvas, Office for the Documents canvas. Victor Villian has written a nice one for Teams, which you'd use in these conversations, but I'll actually look at a different way of building those. But you can use these same techniques to build all of them, to scaffold them out. And then, as I say, TypeScript is the language we'll typically use. React.js, a good choice because there's excellent support in a library called Office UI Fabric, which comes as React components, and also it's being used in the modern pages in SharePoint. So the React framework is there already. So that's why I would tend to steer you towards React unless you have a particular reason to use Angular or Vue or one of these other frameworks. So let's start with the document canvas, and I'll go fairly quickly through these different canvases. So the document canvas is the Office applications, so it's Word, Excel, PowerPoint, and so on. And we looked a little earlier at in the store this email reactor. That's how it actually works. So what happens is, in the case of email reactor, if I want to bring the add-in into play, so this is in the Outlook client, I would click on the reactor which I've installed in Outlook, and it would then look at its manifest file. That's the manifest file, which happens to be in XML in the Office add-ins, and that would point to a hosted add-in web page. In this case, it's actually hosted in Azure, and there's a site that's been made public in Azure that has all the assets and the HTML and the JavaScript, which just then renders this page inside this container, which is on the client application. It's the Web Extensibility Framework. If I was looking at Outlook on the web, that would still work, but it would be hosted in an iframe, but you wouldn't be necessarily aware of that, but that's technically how it's achieved. And then I've used sort of a single page application approach to this, so I could navigate between different pages and do server requests, but what we do here is we actually use the single page application approach to effectively making divs visible and invisible to simulate navigating around the application, or to navigate around the application. And you see along the top of the reactor component, there are a number of what look like tabs, and as you click on those, you get different content. As you go to About and Help and Settings, you get different pages of content, but it's actually not going back to the server. It's just making different panels visible underneath, and that's quite a common technique. And we're using also the Office UI Fabric, which is you can see that as just a CSS and JavaScript library, or you can use React components to build these things out very easily and give them the look and feel of the Office application that they're running in. So this is the whole point. From the user's perspective, it doesn't feel as though they've left Office. Everything is just looks like part of Office, but it's actually rendered using a completely different technology inside the web extensibility framework in the case of an Office client application. And I happen to have hosted it in Azure using an Azure website, but I could have used any technology I wanted. So if I'd been a Ruby on Rails developer, I probably would have used that, and it would have worked in exactly the same way. So there's now that was built using, it was actually built using Visual Studio. There is actually good support for Office add-in development in Visual Studio, but I going to look at two other ways, which is to look at Script Lab. So let me open Excel. I'm going to open Microsoft Excel, and we'll start with a blank workbook. And there's this great tool. It's an add-in. So if I wanted to install an add-in, I go to Insert and then Get Add-ins. And if you want to do this yourselves, you need to search for an add-in called Script Lab. So it's Script Space Lab. Otherwise, it won't find it if you don't put the space in. And then you can add this add-in. Now, I've already done that. I get an additional tab here called Script Lab. And if I open this, one of the tabs, which is called Code, I hope this doesn't take too long to load up. And I get some codes. I get a code editor here. So what's actually happening here is I've got an Office add-in that is an editing tool that is itself an Office add-in, and I can go and look at. There's a bit of sample code here. I can run it as well. So there's another panel here. So this second panel is actually the add-in running. And if I show that working, if I select a few cells here, just waiting for it to start up, and say highlight selected range, you see what it's done is it's executed this code here. And if I change the color, say to blue here, now notice how that second panel got updated. So these are both add-ins. This is just the Script Lab add-in, and this is the actual add-in in the Run panel. This is automatically refreshed, and now if I do it again, it's changed it. And I can look at some sample code here. So let's find a fun sample. The wheel of colors looks pretty. Looks like so we've got a syntax error in the sample code here, which is a bit sad. Let's see if we can just debug that. Line 75. Looks like we've got an extra brace there. Get rid of that. Now it works. And if I click start the wheel, I think it's building a pie chart, isn't it? It's using the charts capability in Excel. So it's using this library to get at the content of the application. So I can build very powerful things here, and I don't have to go in depth, but I can use this to prototype these add-ins. I wouldn't recommend necessarily using this for your production work, but for that, I would say you probably want to go to a tool like start with the Yeoman generator. So let me just clear the screen here. So I'm in a command window, and I can say Yo Office, and it will run this Yeoman generator, which will actually start to give you a dialog and say, right, this is the Yeoman generator. What type of project do you want to build? Let's say React, and I'll just leave that default. It won't work. And I say I want to build an Excel add-in, and it would then go, well, if it hadn't already created one, it would go off and scaffold out the project, which takes about 2 seconds. Let me do it again because it really doesn't take very long to do that stage. Change of mind, I won't bother, but it takes a few seconds to scaffold out, and then it does a process called npm install, which really does take quite a long time. So that's not really worth sitting watching that happen. I created one already, so I'm going to go into the Excel add-in folder, and I'm going to run Visual Studio Code. So this is code. If you haven't seen it before, it's a nice editor. And the interesting thing is it's actually built using HTML and JavaScript and CSS. So don't let anybody tell you that you can't build sophisticated applications using these tools. That's exactly what Visual Studio Code is using. If you don't believe me, you can toggle the developer tools and you see those are the actual developer tools from Chrome, because it's using the Chrome engine to build this in using Atom V8, I think the JavaScript engine's called. So that's Visual Studio Code, and looking at this add-in. So I can go down to here, and now I can use this, and this is a bit more powerful because I can start working on the manifest file. This is the manifest file. You see it's an XML file, which tells it what to do in various situations on different platforms. And inside the code itself, well, it's written in TypeScript, and you can see some various points where you can add some code. So one of the things you could do is prototype something here and then say, well, I'll just take this code here, copy it, and go over to here and insert it. You know, I've sort of already made a start on building something. It's not going to work, but you know, I can make a start on building something by prototyping it and then building it into Visual Studio Code and then building it using the various build tools from here. So, I mean, we could talk on and on about this topic, but I'm going to just lay this aside, having established that we can use that similar set of techniques. We can also do something similar when we look at the page canvas, which is SharePoint, of course. So what we can do there is use the SharePoint framework, which you've probably heard about, which allows us to do web parts, these client-side web parts, in addition to a number of other extensions, which include these application customizers and command sets and field customizers. And again, a lot of people are doing demos of the SharePoint framework, so I won't spend too long on it. A couple of new things that have come up recently is the isolated web parts, which are going to make it a lot easier to build web parts that protect some of the intellectual property or the endpoints that you're talking about, which is going to make it a lot easier, I think, for people to write commercial web parts rather than purely line of business solutions. We've got app pages where the web part takes over the whole of the page rather than it being embedded inside an editable page. So that will be very interesting as well. So a lot of new features coming out quite rapidly now. And there's a SharePoint starter kit. So if you wanted to build a solution and just get something up and running, and rather than building it up from scratch, you might want to start with a complete solution and take things away, so sort of build by subtraction, as it were. Then a good idea is to go for this SharePoint starter kit, which is a very complete sort of intranet solution that you can deploy into perhaps a trial tenant initially, to check to see if it does what you want, and then it comes with a host of web parts and templates already set up, and you can then start removing the bits you don't need and adjusting the bits you do, and very quickly come up with a solution using these modern development techniques. Right, slide deck, where's it gone? Looks like that's what I wanted. So that's the SharePoint starter kit. We just quickly looked at that. Now, when it comes to Teams, of course, we've got this conversations canvas. So this is our third canvas that we're looking at. And There's a whole bunch of tools for building on top of Teams. So you can use that to, again, same idea as in the Office add-ins and the SharePoint extensions, where you're bringing things into the places that people already are rather than asking them to start some new application. And the same, as people spend more and more time in Teams, then this is a great place to deliver software and get people working. So one of the more recent developments is we can use now these SharePoint framework components inside Teams, which is quite exciting, and we'll look at that in a second. So we can now we see how now the pieces are fitting together, the Duplo bricks and the Lego bricks all starting to click together now, and we can use the SharePoint framework in Teams. We can also use the Teams tabs in SharePoint, which is an interesting thing to get your head around, because it sounds like it's not that important or something you want to do, but it is significant because it means you're in a position where you can have effectively an external website hosted inside a SharePoint site, which the nearest thing we've had to that before is the SharePoint add-ins. So it's another situation where we don't need to go to the SharePoint add-in model, possibly the last situation, getting close to one of the last situations where we need to go to the SharePoint add-in model. We can use the SharePoint framework to achieve what we want to. So just looking at Teams, I've got a copy of Teams open here, and there is this tool called App Studio. So if you go to here and select App Studio, you have to install it. So you'd have to go and find the App Studio app, and then once you get that, you get it. So it's a little bit like the script lab. It's a tool inside the application that you're developing for that helps you build out some of these manifests. So remember, the manifest is the key to all this. So you can say, I want to create a new app, or use one of the ones you've worked on before, and start building out the capabilities. So in Teams, we can add our own tabs, which can just be something, might be just, I want to bring my website, which is all I've done here, and bring it into the Teams application. There's bots as well, which is a whole topic in itself, and connectors were mentioned in the context of some of these other tools like Power Apps and Flow. We can use connectors in here as well. And this tool will actually allow you, we can also use adaptive cards, so we can see how all these things are coming together. We can use the adaptive cards techniques as well to build things inside of Teams. And what we can then do is, if I can remember where it was, is we can export the components. Let's open that one, and there should be a button somewhere to export. I've forgotten where it is. We can then export here we are, test and distribute. I can download a manifest file containing all that, and then everything that I've configured so far will appear in this, and I get a manifest JSON. So it's this manifest JSON that I can use. It's just a JSON file that I can use to say, here's my extension, say a Teams tab, and this is where to go to get the web content to render it. And we can then bring that over to SharePoint, because SharePoint now recognizes that as well. So that was App Studio. There's also, as I mentioned, Victor Villien created a YoTeams Yeoman generator. So you can do YoTeams if you've got it installed. I haven't actually on this machine, but YoTeams, and that will do a similar job to what the App Studio did, give you a few more options as well. And what was the last thing I was going to show was I can go to the SharePoint framework. So we didn't do this yet. So I'm sure you've seen this 1,000 times, Microsoft/SharePoint, and that will run a Yeoman generator to create a SharePoint application. Now the latest version of it, which I don't think I've got installed actually on here, but the latest version of it will, as you get to choose, do I want to support the latest version, or do I want to have some backwards compatibility so I can use it on premises? And I can go down here and it will let me build web parts and extensions. But what you'll see if you use the latest version of the client is it will scaffold out a in this folder here. So let's run Visual Studio Code in that folder. This is what it would have created if I'd let that run with the current version. You'll see a new Teams tab, Teams folder, in addition to the web parts folder. So under source in the generated project, we've got web parts as before, but we've also got this Teams folder, which is very simple. It just contains a manifest. So that's the same manifest schema that we created in App Studio. And that will then, if we bundle that up with a couple of images that it requires, you bundle that up into a zip file, and that's a Teams tab that you can upload into Teams, and then your web part will be, once you've gone through the installation steps, the web part will be rendered inside Teams. So I'm running out of time, so I don't really have time to show that because I just want to wrap up the slide deck. So just to finish off, so we'll look at Teams tabs in SharePoint pages. So the tabs in SharePoint pages is significant because it really gives us a way, although it doesn't look as though it gives you that much, it's the way of having a provider hosted application, externally hosted in some other website, and surface it inside SharePoint. So very interesting development. Microsoft Graph, of course, underlies all this, so we can use the Microsoft Graph to get all these trillions of nodes of data inside the Microsoft Graph, which is now giving us access through one single endpoint to all of Office 365, all the Windows 10 bits of Microsoft 365 and the enterprise mobility and security components. Those are all now coming under this one endpoint, which is, without going into the details, it's greatly simplifying our development efforts. And there's an MS Graph client component in the SharePoint framework, which makes it super easy to get at these and get the tokens. You don't have to go through all this complicated business to manage the authorization from within an SharePoint site, because of course you're already authenticated in the context of the SharePoint site. So that tool is able to leverage the fact that you already have the authentication set up and just seamlessly give you access to it. So I won't go into that at the moment. If I had more time, we could go into that as well. So just to wrap up, really, looking at the whole of Microsoft 365, which is a very broad topic to cover in an hour, but just to give an overview, it is really a development platform which is almost, got the reach of the web itself. So it's a fantastic opportunity to develop your skills. There's one set of skills that you can use in all these places inside Office 365, Microsoft 365, the Office clients. You can use different levels of complexity, so you can run up through the gears of starting with, is there a bought-in component? And if not, we can maybe build something no code. We can use one of these low code solutions to get a quick win. And we've got fantastic tooling using this modern development tool chain to build actual code. And don't worry about it being JavaScript. TypeScript will make it a much more robust development environment, gives us strong typing and the latest features of JavaScript. So I would strongly encourage you to, if you haven't already done so, learn TypeScript, learn about these tools, see how you can reuse a lot of these same development techniques and build components, possibly even reuse components or code across these different canvases on Microsoft 365. So I hope that was useful or thought-provoking. Do go to dev.office.com, easy URL to remember. That's the starting page. It will redirect you to a starting page which has all the documentation. There's great training resources. You can sign up for the Office 365 developer program and get you That will get you a developer tenant, which is, I think, as long as you keep using it, I think it is now pretty much unlimited in how long it will last for and get you up and running. So, hope that was useful. Thank you very much, Shane. Over to you.
Thanks, Bill. Yeah, we're nearly out of time, so we'll run through some quick questions, Bill, if that's okay.
Yeah, yes.
Great. And by the way, thank you for a great presentation. If you've any questions, do type them in, or you can reach out to Bill following this webinar. Okay, first question. The challenge being faced by a SharePoint developer or technologist at present is to decide whether to embrace something new like Angular, Node, React, or how to be relevant to an organization with the skill set SharePoint on-premise, CSOM, or JSON. How do you get out of this dilemma?
Yeah. Well, I think clearly there are cases where you're going to want to use some of these legacy tools. And if you've got an on-premises SharePoint environment and maybe you're stuck in SharePoint 2010, that's quite common actually, or 2013, one of these older versions, and you've got 50 web parts and this very custom portal, and somebody says we need this quick change making to one of these web parts so it does this other thing. That's not the time to be saying, no, we've got to scrap everything and go to the SharePoint framework. So there are situations where you're going to want to continue using these older techniques. Or if you've built something with CSOM, CSOM is going to keep working. You don't have to throw that away and say, I must use Microsoft Graph now. And particularly if you're on premises, it's not available to you. But if you're starting something new, I really encourage you to look at these newer development tools and use that as your starting point, because that's where all the momentum is and all the development effort is going on Microsoft's part is going into. And I would say that that's the SharePoint framework and tools like React. And let's be honest, in 12 months time it could be something else. It's a fast changing field. Right now it's React. It could be some other framework that we don't know about yet that somebody's working on in some large tech company somewhere, or some even in the back bedroom. We just don't know. It's a very dynamic field, but at the moment, I would recommend, use the newer tools if you possibly can. If you have to, of course, the older techniques are still valid, still supported, still available to you for the most part, except for sandbox solutions.
Okay, which is the best way to customize the behavior of a SharePoint list item details form in the modern experience? Is it possible to do it by JavaScript with JS link injection technique in the classic experience?
Yeah, well, you could use the classic experience, but if you're in the modern pages, then the JS link isn't available. But there's a SharePoint framework extension for lists you can use. So check what's currently available in the SharePoint framework. So if you're in a modern page, that will be the way to do it.
Okay. On behalf of the ESPC community, thank you, Bill, for taking the time today to complete this webinar. We really appreciate it.
Thank you, Shane. It's been fun. I hope it was useful to people who are seeing it or who download it.
Excellent. Well, there's one comment in here and it says, this is one of the best webinars I've seen this year. Thanks, Bill. So I think that's the proof of the pudding.
That's awesome. Thanks. Whoever that was, thank you so much.
Great. Thank you, Bill. We'll talk to you again.
Thanks, Shane. Speak later. Bye-bye.
Thank you.